The air in Chicago O'Hare International Airport hummed with a familiar, anxious energy, a symphony of rolling suitcases, muffled announcements, and the quiet shuffling of thousands of lives in transit. For one man, a decorated federal agent flying under the radar, it was just another sterile corridor on the path to his next mission. But for another, a TSA officer with eyes like chips of ice and a soul soured by resentment, that corridor was his kingdom. In the next few moments, these two worlds would collide in a way that would shatter the pretense of security and expose a rot hiding in plain sight. This isn't just a story about racial profiling. It's about the terrifying moment when a man with a small amount of power tries to break a man who holds a nation's secrets, and the earth-shattering karma that followed. The fluorescent lights of Terminal 3 at Chicago O'Hare beat down with an impartial, sterile glare, bleaching the color from the river of humanity flowing through its veins. It was a place of organized chaos, a nexus of hellos and goodbyes, of hurried footsteps and the low, constant murmur of anticipation. Agent Julian Hayes, special agent with the Federal Bureau of Investigation, was an island of calm in this restless sea. Dressed in a charcoal gray travel blazer by Brooks Brothers, a simple white button-down, and dark slacks, he could have been any mid-level executive, a consultant or a lawyer. He projected an aura of quiet confidence, his movements economical and precise as he placed his well-worn leather briefcase and his carry-on, a reinforced Pelican case, onto the gray plastic bin of the TSA security conveyor belt. Julian was a man who lived in the details. He noticed the slight scuff on the tile near the X-ray machine, the weary expression on the face of a young mother juggling a toddler in a diaper bag, the way the air conditioning vent above him rattled with a faint, rhythmic tremor. This meticulous observation was not a choice. It was a survival instinct honed over a decade of service in the FBI's counterterrorism division. He had worked in the shadows of dusty Afghan villages, the polished boardrooms of international finance, and the grimy back alleys of American cities. An airport security line, by comparison, was supposed to be the easy part. He slipped off his Allen Edmonds loafers, placed his laptop in its own bin, and walked through the metal detector without a beep. He was clean. He was always clean. His life was a testament to discipline and control. As he waited for his belongings to emerge from the humming maw of the X-ray machine, he felt a familiar prickle on the back of his neck. It was the feeling of being watched. Not the casual, sweeping gaze of a security professional, but something more pointed, more personal. His eyes flickered to the side, scanning the TSA officers manning the station. Most were engaged in the monotonous rhythm of their work, directing passengers, watching monitors, swabbing for explosives. But one man stood apart. He was older than the others, perhaps in his late 50s, with a bulldog-like face, a thick neck that strained against the collar of his blue uniform, and a name tag that read Peterson. Officer Rick Peterson wasn't looking at the monitor. He was staring directly at Julian, his lips curled into a barely perceptible sneer. Julian had seen that look 1,000 times before. It was a look that bypassed the expensive suit and the confident posture and saw only one thing, the color of his skin. It was a look of instant judgment, of pre-written narratives and foregone conclusions. Julian held the officer's gaze for a brief moment, his expression unreadable, before turning his attention back to the conveyor belt. He would not give this man the satisfaction of a reaction. His briefcase and shoes emerged, followed by his laptop. But the Pelican case, the most important item, was diverted. It slid onto a separate stainless steel roller table designated for secondary screening. And waiting for it, with a sense of grim satisfaction, was Officer Peterson. "This one's mine," Peterson announced to a younger, nervous-looking female agent, Sarah Jenkins, who had been about to step forward. His voice was a low growl, thick with the gravel of 1,000 cigarettes. He gestured for Julian to approach with a flick of his wrist, a gesture one might use for a dog. Julian walked over, his face a mask of polite neutrality. "Is there a problem, officer?" he asked, his voice calm and even. Peterson tapped a thick finger on the top of the Pelican case. "That's what we're going to find out, aren't we?" He didn't look at Julian when he spoke, instead addressing the case as if it were the one being questioned. Lots of electronics in here. Dense. What's in the box, pal? The term pal was laced with a casual condescension that set Julian's teeth on edge. It's work equipment, officer. It's sensitive. Sensitive, Peterson repeated, drawing the word out. He finally lifted his gaze to meet Julian's. His eyes were a pale, washed-out blue, and they held a look of profound, bored malice. Everyone's got sensitive equipment these days. What kind of work? This was the dance, the slow, deliberate escalation designed to provoke, to create a reason for a confrontation. Julian knew the rules. He knew his rights. He also knew that in this space, in this moment, those rights were subject to the interpretation of the man in the blue uniform. I'm a consultant, Julian said, offering a piece of his cover story. It was vague enough to be true and uninteresting enough to hopefully end the encounter. Peterson let out a short, humorless laugh. He picked up a pair of blue nitrile gloves and began pulling them on with an exaggerated slowness. Each snap of the rubber against his skin, a small act of aggression. A consultant. Right. Let's see what kind of consulting requires a military-grade case. He looked over at the younger Agent Jenkins, who was watching with wide, uncomfortable eyes. Get ready to swab everything. Everything. Julian felt a cold knot tighten in his stomach. This wasn't a random screening. This wasn't about protocol. This was a power play. And Officer Rick Peterson, a man whose authority began and ended at the edge of this sterile checkpoint, was determined to be the one in control. The storm was no longer gathering. The first drops of rain had begun to fall. The area for secondary screening was a small, sterile stage, set apart from the main flow of passengers. It put those selected on display, a subtle form of humiliation that amplified their anxiety. Travelers rushing to their gates would cast fleeting, curious glances, their minds quickly filling in the blanks. Troublemaker, threat, other. Julian was acutely aware of these glances as Officer Peterson positioned the Pelican case on the stainless steel table between them. All right, Mr. Consultant, Peterson began, his voice loud enough for those nearby to overhear. Pop it open for me, and do it slowly. Julian placed his hands on the two heavy-duty latches of the case. Officer, with all due respect, the contents of this case are proprietary and classified. I am not authorized to display them in a public setting. Peterson leaned in, his voice dropping to a conspiratorial, menacing whisper. Listen to me. Right now, in this little box we call a security checkpoint, I am the highest authority you will ever meet. Your authorization means jack squat to me. The sign right over there says all baggage is subject to search. You consented to that when you bought your ticket. So are you going to open the case, or are you going to become what we call a person of interest? The threat was clear. Julian's mind raced. The case contained a sophisticated signals intelligence device, a key piece of an ongoing counterterrorism operation. It was a prototype, worth more than Peterson would make in 10 years. But its monetary value was nothing compared to the intelligence it protected. Exposing it on this table, under the fluorescent lights and the prying eyes of O'Hare, would be a catastrophic breach of protocol. I am happy to comply with a private screening, Julian stated, keeping his voice level. I'm sure you have a room for that purpose. We can have your supervisor present. This was the correct procedure. It was the de-escalation route. It was also a direct challenge to Peterson's authority on his own stage, and the officer's face darkened. You don't get to make the rules here, he snapped. I'll decide if we need a private room. Right now, I'm deciding to do this right here, right now. Open it. A woman in a sharp business suit who had been watching from the redressing area took a step forward. Excuse me, officer, she said, her voice crisp and authoritative. That man has requested a private screening, which he is entitled to under TSA regulations if he has concerns about medically or professionally sensitive items. You should honor that. Peterson's head whipped around to face her. Ma'am, this does not concern you. Step back and mind your own business, or you'll be missing your flight. The woman, whose name was Amelia Vance, a partner at a prestigious Chicago law firm, did not flinch. It concerns me when I see a citizen's rights being ignored by a federal employee. Your behavior is unprofessional. Peterson's face flushed a dangerous shade of red. He pointed a trembling, gloved finger at her. "One more word, and I'll have you detained for interfering with a security screening." He turned back to Julian, his fury now fully ignited. "See what you did? You're causing a scene. You're disrupting the peace." It was a classic tactic. Blame the victim for the reaction to the abuse. Julian held up his hands in a gesture of placation. "There's no need for this to escalate, officer." "It escalated when you brought a suspicious case into my airport," Peterson retorted. He grabbed the case and with a grunt of effort, pried one of the latches open himself. "Officer, do not do that." Julian's voice was sharp now, cutting through the din of the terminal. It was the voice of a man used to giving commands and having them obeyed instantly. The tone, more than the words, gave Peterson a moment's pause. But it was only a moment. His pride, pricked by Julian's tone and the lawyer's intervention, overrode any flicker of caution. "I'll do whatever I deem necessary to ensure the safety of this airport." He fumbled with the second latch. Julian knew he had seconds before the case was open. He could physically intervene, but that would be an assault on a federal officer, a career-ending, life-altering mistake. His mind worked furiously, calculating angles, weighing consequences. His mission parameters were clear: protect the asset at all costs, but do not compromise your cover unless absolutely necessary. The needle was tipping rapidly toward absolutely necessary. "What's the problem here, Rick?" a new voice interjected. It was the supervisor, a man named David Chen, who had been alerted by the junior agent, Sarah Jenkins. Chen was a man who lived by the book, but his primary book was the one titled Avoid Paperwork and Headaches. Peterson straightened up, a self-righteous expression on his face. "Supervisor Chen, this passenger is refusing to have his bag searched. He's being belligerent and uncooperative. His case is full of dense electronics, and he won't tell me what they are. He's causing a disturbance." Chen looked at Julian, his expression weary. "Sir, you have to understand, we have our procedures. It would be much easier for everyone if you just cooperated." "I have been cooperating," Julian said, his voice a tight coil of restraint. "I have repeatedly requested a private screening for my professional equipment, a request your officer has denied while becoming increasingly hostile. I have been calm. I have been respectful. Your officer has not." Chen sighed, rubbing the bridge of his nose. He was caught between a belligerent subordinate he didn't particularly like but felt obligated to defend, and a passenger who sounded articulate and was clearly not going to back down. He chose the path of least resistance. "Rick, just be quick about it," Chen said, effectively green-lighting the public search. He gave Julian an apologetic shrug, a silent admission of his own powerlessness or unwillingness to confront his own officer. That was it. The system had failed. The supervisor had abdicated his responsibility. Peterson, vindicated, turned back to the case with a triumphant smirk. He put his hand on the final latch. "Last chance," Peterson goaded. "Open it yourself, or I will." Julian looked at Peterson. He looked at the supervisor, Chen, who was already trying to distance himself from the scene. He looked at the young agent, Jenkins, who was biting her lip, her eyes pleading with him to just give in. He looked at the lawyer, Amelia Vance, who was now discreetly recording the entire exchange on her phone. And then he made his decision. The cover was blown, but the asset would be protected. More importantly, this abuse of power would not stand. "Step away from the case, Officer Peterson," Julian said. His voice was no longer that of a consultant. It was flat, cold, and heavy with an authority that dwarfed anything a TSA uniform could bestow. Peterson laughed. "Or what? You'll write a strongly worded letter?" Julian reached into the inner pocket of his blazer, his movements fluid and deliberate. He withdrew a black leather credential case. He didn't flip it open with a dramatic flourish. He simply held it in his hand, letting the weight of it speak for itself. "Or I will place you under arrest for interfering with a federal investigation. 49 U.S. Code Part of 114. And trust me, officer, the place you're going, they don't care about your authority." For a long moment, nobody moved. The credential case in Julian Hayes' hand seemed to absorb all the sound in the immediate vicinity, creating a pocket of profound silence in the bustling terminal. Officer Peterson stared at the black leather as if it were a venomous snake, his smug expression frozen on his face, beginning to crack at the edges. Supervisor Chen, who had been trying to fade into the background, took an involuntary step forward, his eyes wide with disbelief. "What is this? Some kind of joke?" Peterson stammered, his bravado faltering for the first time. He was trying to regain his footing, to reassert his dominance, but his voice lacked its earlier conviction. Julian didn't answer. With a flick of his thumb, he opened the credential case. There it was, nestled in the leather. On one side, his photo identification, his face calm and professional, under the words United States Department of Justice. On the other side, the iconic gold badge of the Federal Bureau of Investigation, gleaming under the harsh airport lighting. The eagle, the scales of justice, the shield, a symbol of power so absolute it made Peterson's TSA badge look like a child's toy. "Special Agent Julian Hayes, FBI," Julian stated, his voice as cold and hard as the steel table between them. "And you, Officer Peterson, are now impeding a matter of national security. For the final time, I am ordering you to step away from the operational equipment." The transformation in the air was palpable. It was as if the laws of physics in that small section of the airport had been rewritten. One moment, Peterson was the undisputed king of his little fiefdom. The next, he was a trespassing peasant standing before the king's own minister. Peterson's face went from flushed red to a pasty, sickly white. The blood seemed to drain from his head, and he swayed slightly on his feet. He looked from the badge to Julian's face, and for the first time, he truly saw the man in front of him. Not as a target for his prejudice, but as a predator whose territory he had foolishly encroached upon. The sneer was gone, replaced by a mask of pure, unadulterated fear. Supervisor Chen rushed forward, his hands held up in a frantic, placating gesture. "Whoa, whoa, whoa, okay. Let's all just calm down. Agent Hayes, I am so sorry. There's been a misunderstanding. A terrible misunderstanding." "There has been no misunderstanding, Supervisor Chen," Julian replied, his eyes still locked on Peterson. "I identified myself as carrying sensitive professional equipment. I requested the proper protocol for a private screening. Your officer refused. You upheld his refusal. What I misunderstand is why TSA protocols are being ignored by the very people assigned to enforce them." Chen was sweating now, his bureaucratic composure completely shattered. "Rick, what the hell did you do?" he hissed at his subordinate. Peterson couldn't speak. He just stood there, his gloved hands frozen over the case, his mouth opening and closing like a fish out of water. The junior agent, Sarah Jenkins, looked as if she wanted the floor to swallow her whole. The lawyer, Amelia Vance, who had stopped recording, walked calmly to Julian's side. "Agent Hayes," she said, her voice steady, "I have a video recording of the entire interaction, from the moment Officer Peterson refused your request for a private screening to his supervisor's decision to allow him to proceed. My name is Amelia Vance. Here's my card. I'll be happy to provide a statement as a witness." Julian gave her a curt, appreciative nod. "Thank you, Ms. Vance. I may need that." He then shifted his attention back to the two TSA employees. He pointed a finger at the Pelican case. "This case and all of its contents are now considered part of a federal crime scene, evidence in an investigation into the misconduct of your officer. No one is to touch it. No one is to move it. Am I understood?" "Yes, of course. Absolutely," Chen stammered, wiping his brow with the back of his hand. Julian finally looked away from Peterson, whose career he had just incinerated with a flash of gold and steel. He pulled out his phone. He scrolled through his contacts, his thumb hovering over a name. He wasn't calling a generic field office number. He was calling the direct line of his superior, a woman who did not suffer fools and who wielded the full power of the Bureau with surgical precision. He pressed the call button. "Special Agent in Charge Eleanor Vance, please," he said into the phone, his voice echoing in the stunned silence. "This is Agent Hayes. I have a situation at O'Hare. Code 7. Code 7. Officer obstruction." It was a rare declaration, reserved for when local or other government agency employees were actively and willfully interfering with an FBI operation. It was the kind of call that scrambled jets and dispatched tactical teams. It was, in short, a 5-alarm fire. Peterson let out a small, strangled whimper. He looked at the Pelican case, then at Julian, then at his supervisor. He seemed to finally understand that he hadn't just been bullying a passenger. He had, through his own arrogance and prejudice, kicked open the door to a world of trouble he was utterly unprepared for. The power he had so enjoyed wielding had just turned on him, and he was about to be crushed under its weight. The quiet consultant was gone. In his place stood a federal agent, and the full, terrifying might of the U.S. Department of Justice was about to descend on Gate K-12 of Chicago O'Hare International Airport. The change was instantaneous and absolute. Within 90 seconds of Julian's call, the chaotic hum of the security checkpoint was pierced by the squawk of radios. 2 Chicago Police Department officers assigned to the airport detail arrived, their expressions initially bored and annoyed at another TSA squabble. They saw Supervisor Chen waving them over frantically. "What's the problem, Dave?" one of the cops asked, a heavy-set man with a thick mustache. Before Chen could launch into his panicked, revisionist version of events, Julian stepped forward, his FBI credentials still in his hand. "Officers, I'm Special Agent Hayes. This is a federal matter now. I need you to secure this area. No one in or out of this immediate lane. I also need you to ensure these 2 gentlemen," he gestured to Peterson and Chen, "do not leave. They are material witnesses." The CPD officer's demeanor shifted immediately. They had dealt with federal agents before. They recognized the tone, the lack of ambiguity, the immediate assumption of command. Their allegiance wasn't to the TSA, it was to the bigger badge. "You got it, Agent," the officer replied, his voice now crisp and professional. He and his partner moved to establish a perimeter, effectively quarantining the secondary screening area. Passengers were rerouted, grumbling and confused, as a bubble of sterile authority formed around Julian and his Pelican case. Rick Peterson seemed to shrink inside his uniform. All the blustering aggression had evaporated, leaving behind a hollowed-out shell of a man drenched in the cold sweat of fear. He kept darting his eyes towards the exit, as if contemplating a mad dash. But the presence of the CPD officers, now standing with their arms crossed and their faces impassive, squashed that idea. Supervisor David Chen, meanwhile, was engaged in a desperate campaign of damage control. "Agent Hayes, look, I can handle this internally. I'll write Officer Peterson up. A suspension, maybe even a recommendation for termination. There's no need to involve, well, everyone." Julian looked at him, his expression one of profound disappointment. "Supervisor Chen, your chance to handle this internally was when you witnessed your officer violating a citizen's rights and TSA's own protocols and chose to do nothing. Your chance ended when you abdicated your responsibility and tacitly endorsed his behavior. What's happening now is not punishment. It's a consequence." The words hit Chen like a physical blow. He understood in that moment that he was not just a bystander, he was an accomplice, and his career was now just as precarious as Peterson's. Julian's phone buzzed. It was a text from his superior, SAOS Eleanor Vance. "ETA 15 mins. Local field office team en route. Do not let them leave. Do not let them speak to each other." Eleanor Vance was a legend within the Bureau. A former federal prosecutor, she was known for her razor-sharp intellect and her utter intolerance for incompetence and corruption. When one of her agents made a Code 7 call, she didn't delegate, she descended. "Officers," Julian said to the CPD cops, "please separate them. I want one of them over there." He pointed to a bench 20 feet away. "And the other one here. They are not to communicate in any way." The police complied immediately, escorting a dazed Peterson to the designated bench. He sat down heavily, his face buried in his hands. Julian turned his attention to the junior agent, Sarah Jenkins. She was standing by the X-ray machine, wringing her hands, looking terrified. He walked over to her, his demeanor softening slightly. "Agent Jenkins?" he asked. Her name tag was clearly visible. It's Officer Jenkins," she whispered, her voice trembling. "My apologies." "Officer Jenkins," Julian corrected himself. "You witnessed the entire interaction, correct?" She nodded, unable to meet his eyes. "Yes, sir." "Did you feel your partner's conduct was appropriate?" She hesitated, her eyes flicking towards her supervisor Chen, who was watching her intently. She was young, likely new to the job, caught between the fear of retribution from her colleagues and the imposing presence of a federal agent. I'm not supposed to." "You took an oath, Officer Jenkins," Julian said, his voice firm but not unkind. "An oath to the Constitution, not to your partner or your supervisor. I'm not asking for a formal statement now. That will come later. But I want you to think very carefully about what you saw here today. The truth has a way of coming out. It's always better to be on the right side of it when it does. He let the words hang in the air before walking back towards his case, leaving her to wrestle with her conscience. Less than 15 minutes later, the scene changed again. Three people in dark suits, moving with a unity of purpose that set them apart from the airport crowd, arrived at the checkpoint. They were agents from the FBI's Chicago field office. They conferred briefly with Julian, who gave them a concise, dispassionate summary of the events. One of the local agents, a tall man named Peterson, an irony not lost on Julian, approached the CPD officers. "We'll take it from here. We'll need your incident reports." The other two agents walked over to Chen and the now catatonic Rick Peterson. "Supervisor Chen, Officer Peterson, we're with the FBI. We need you to come with us. You'll be escorted to our resident office here at the airport to give a formal statement." It wasn't a request. The two TSA employees were led away, not in handcuffs, but with a finality that made it clear their lives had been irrevocably altered. As Peterson was walked past Julian, he finally looked up, his pale blue eyes filled with a mixture of hatred and desperation. "You ruined my life," he hissed. Julian met his gaze without flinching. "You did this to yourself, officer. You just used me to do it." Just as they disappeared from view, a woman with sharp, intelligent eyes and silver hair, cut in a severe, no-nonsense bob, arrived. She was dressed in a perfectly tailored pantsuit and moved with an aura of command that made even the other FBI agents stand a little straighter. "Julian," Special Agent in Charge Eleanor Vance said, her voice calm as a frozen lake. "Report." Julian stood before his boss and laid out the facts, from Peterson's initial stare to Chen's abdication of duty. He concluded by gesturing to the lawyer who had remained nearby. "And this is Ms. Amelia Vance. She witnessed the entire event and has it on video." Eleanor Vance turned to Amelia, extending a hand. "Ms. Vance, I'm SAC Vance. No relation, I assume," she said with a hint of a smile. "On behalf of the FBI, I want to thank you for your civic courage. That video will be invaluable. An agent will take your statement and get a copy of that file." She then turned her steely gaze back to the Pelican case still sitting on the steel table. "The asset is secure?" "Yes, ma'am," Julian confirmed. "Never opened." "Good," she said. She surveyed the scene, the rerouted passengers, the lingering CPD officers, the gaping hole where two TSA officers used to be. "This is not just about one of your agents being harassed, Julian. This is a systemic failure. A TSA officer with that kind of temperament is not just a bully, he's a security risk. He's a weak link in the chain. I want to know everything about him. I want his file, his service record, his complaints, his commendations. I want to know who he has lunch with and what websites he visits at night. Dig. This isn't over. This is just the beginning." Julian nodded, a grim sense of purpose settling over him. This was no longer just about the insult he had endured. It was about the deeper rot that the insult had revealed, and Eleanor Vance had just given him the authority to rip it out by the roots. The FBI's resident agency office at O'Hare is a place that most travelers will never see. Tucked away in an anonymous corridor, it is a sterile, functional space of government-issue desks, secure computer terminals, and the constant, low hum of servers. It was here, 2 days after the incident, that the investigation into Rick Peterson began in earnest. What started as a simple internal affairs inquiry into misconduct was rapidly evolving into something far more complex. SAC Eleanor Vance was not a woman who believed in coincidences. She operated on the principle that a person's behavior, no matter how irrational it seemed, was always driven by an underlying logic. Rick Peterson's overt, self-destructive aggression towards a federal agent struck her as more than just a simple case of racial bias and a power trip. It was too reckless. It was the behavior of a man who was either profoundly stupid or profoundly desperate. Vance never bet on stupid. "What have we got on him?" she asked, standing over the desk of a young, tech-savvy agent named Tim Rowling, who was pulling up Peterson's digital life. Julian stood beside her, sipping a cup of lukewarm coffee. "Richard Peterson, 58, Rowling began, reading from his screen. former police officer, Rockford PD, left the force in 2008. The official record says early retirement for personal reasons. That's always a flag. Get his police file unsealed, Vance ordered. I want to know the real reason. Use my authority. I want to see every complaint, every internal review, everything. Already on it, ma'am, Rowling confirmed. Joined the TSA in 2010. Service record is interesting. He's got a stack of minor passenger complaints, mostly for rude behavior. All of them were dismissed by his direct supervisor, David Chen. But he also has an unusually high number of discretionary seizures of electronics and currency. Julian leaned in closer. What does that mean? It means he's a pro at finding reasons to confiscate items from passengers, Rowling explained. Cash over the $10,000 declaration limit, expensive laptops he claims have anomalies on the scanner, jewelry. In most cases, the items are eventually returned after a mountain of paperwork, but a significant percentage are never claimed. The passengers give up or can't prove ownership. It's a legal gray area, but Peterson's numbers are 3 times the terminal average. He's a thief, Julian stated flatly, hiding behind his badge. It gets better, Rowling said, clicking his mouse. We pulled his financials. For a guy on a TSA salary, he lives well. No major debts. His mortgage is paid off. He makes a monthly payment of $2,000 to a holding company, a shell corporation. Trace it, Vance commanded. Way ahead of you, Rowling replied with a grin. It took some digging, but the shell company is owned by another company, which is owned by a law firm that specializes in asset protection for clients involved in import-export. Smuggling, Vance and Julian said in unison. The pieces began to click into place. This wasn't just about a bitter racist officer. Rick Peterson was very likely a corrupt official, using his position at a major international airport to facilitate a criminal enterprise. His aggression, his eagerness to confiscate electronics, it was a pattern. The next piece of the puzzle came from a very nervous Sarah Jenkins. After 2 days of agonizing, she had contacted the number the FBI had given her and agreed to give a formal, confidential statement. Julian conducted the interview himself in a quiet room far from the prying eyes of her TSA colleagues. At first, she was hesitant, speaking in vague terms about Peterson being a bully and difficult to work with. Julian let her talk, patiently listening, creating a space of safety. Sarah, he said gently after she had fallen silent, I know this is difficult. You're afraid of losing your job. But what you saw happen to me, has it happened before? Tears welled in her eyes. Not like that. Not with, but with him, there were things that didn't make sense. Tell me, Julian encouraged. He had his favorites, she began, her voice barely a whisper. Certain guys, they'd come through his line, always with the same type of black roller bags. He'd pull them for secondary, make a big show of it, but he'd do the search himself. He'd never let me or anyone else swab their bags. He'd be gruff with them, yell at them a bit for the cameras, and then clear them through. It was like a little play. Did you ever see what was in the bags? Julian asked, his pulse quickening. No, he was always careful, but one time a latch on one of the bags broke. Just for a second I saw inside. It was full of iPhones, dozens of them, still in the box, way more than anyone would have for personal use. Did you report it? She shook her head, ashamed. To who? Supervisor Chen? Chen knew. He was always the one who scheduled Rick for that specific lane at those specific times. They were in it together. This was the smoking gun. Peterson and Chen weren't just covering up misconduct. They were running a smuggling ring right under the nose of airport security. High-end, untraceable electronics were a common currency in the criminal underworld, used for everything from money laundering to equipping terrorist cells. And the confrontation with me? Julian pressed. Why was he so aggressive? I don't know for sure, Sarah said, thinking hard. But one of the courier, he looked a little like you. Same height, same build, also a black man who dressed well. He was due to come through that morning on a flight to Dubai. Maybe Rick thought you were him and you were trying to double-cross him. Or maybe he was just trying to create a diversion. He got so loud and angry with you, every other officer was watching our lane. It would have been the perfect time for the real courier to slip through a different line unnoticed. A chill went down Julian's spine. His ordeal hadn't been a random act of prejudice. It was a calculated move in a criminal conspiracy. He had been either a case of mistaken identity or a convenient distraction. His very presence, which Peterson had profiled as that of a potential criminal, had inadvertently stumbled into an actual crime in progress. Later that day, the sealed records from the Rockford PD arrived. The real reason Rick Peterson had left the force was a sustained complaint for shaking down local business owners and evidence tampering in a drug case. He had been given a choice: resign quietly or face prosecution. He chose to walk. And David Chen, his TSA supervisor? A background check revealed he had declared bankruptcy 2 years prior due to massive gambling debts. He was a man who was desperate for money. The web was no longer unseen. It was now laid bare on the desks of the O'Hare FBI office. A bitter, disgraced ex-cop and a gambling-addicted supervisor had turned a vital security checkpoint into their own private criminal enterprise. Eleanor Vance stood before a whiteboard, drawing lines between the names and the evidence. "They're not just smugglers," she said, her voice grim. "They are a clear and present danger to national security. Anyone willing to smuggle iPhones for cash is willing to smuggle a weapon for the right price. We're not just taking down a couple of corrupt officers anymore. We're plugging a hole that could sink the entire ship." She turned to Julian. "And you, Agent Hayes, are going to be the one to do it." The plan was audacious, built on the very foundation of Peterson and Chen's corrupt system. They would use the smuggler's own routine against them. Sarah Jenkins, now a confidential informant under FBI protection, provided the final, crucial details. The flight number of the next courier, the type of bag he would be carrying, and the coded phrase he would use to signal Peterson. The phrase was innocuous, something about the unpredictable Chicago weather. The sting, codenamed Operation Broken Gate, was scheduled for a Tuesday morning, 3 days later. The chosen courier, a man named Leo, was a low-level mule in the organization, making him the perfect bait. The FBI's goal wasn't just to catch Peterson in the act, but to grab the courier and flip him, allowing them to climb the ladder of the entire smuggling network. Julian Hayes sat in the airport's central surveillance room, a dark, cavernous space filled with a wall of monitors displaying hundreds of camera feeds. He was no longer a passenger, but a hunter. Beside him, Agent Rowling from the Chicago field office coordinated a team of 24 plainclothes agents positioned throughout the terminal. Some posed as travelers, others as airport employees. Eleanor Vance watched from a command post nearby, a silent, formidable presence. "He's through check-in," an agent's voice crackled over the secure comms. "Black roller bag, blue blazer, proceeding towards the Terminal 3 checkpoint." On the monitor, Julian watched the man named Leo move through the crowd. He looked nervous, constantly checking his phone. He fit the profile of 100 other anxious travelers, invisible in his own mundane way. "Subject is approaching the security lanes," the comms updated. "He's getting in lane 4, Peterson's lane." Julian zoomed in on the feed for lane 4. There was Rick Peterson, looking smug and relaxed. He was back on duty, albeit on a short leash after the misunderstanding with Julian, which Chen had successfully spun as a procedural disagreement. They had no idea they were being watched. They believed they had gotten away with it. Supervisor David Chen was also visible, hovering near the supervisor's podium, pretending to oversee the checkpoint, but his eyes kept flicking towards lane 4. Leo placed his bag on the conveyor belt. As he walked towards the metal detector, he made eye contact with Peterson. "Crazy weather we're having," Leo said, loud enough for Peterson to hear. "They say sun, but it feels like a storm's coming." The code phrase. "Tell me about it," Peterson grunted back, a signal of acknowledgement. As Leo's bag went through the X-ray, Peterson immediately flagged it, just as Sarah had described. "Secondary screening," he barked, pulling the bag onto his stainless steel table. This was the critical moment, the play. "You, with me," Peterson ordered Leo, gesturing him over. He started unzipping the bag, his body deliberately blocking the view of the other TSA agents in the security cameras. It was a practiced move, designed to look like a thorough search while allowing him to bypass the required protocols, like swabbing for explosives. "Move in. Now," Julian said calmly into his microphone. The terminal, for the second time in a week, became a stage for a federal operation. But this time, there was no slow escalation. It was a swift, silent, and overwhelming display of force. A man who had been pretending to tie his shoe stood up, revealing the FBI insignia on his jacket. A woman who had been reading a magazine at a nearby gate closed it and began walking purposefully toward the lane. Two janitors pushing a cleaning cart abandoned it, their true purpose revealed. Peterson was hunched over the bag when he felt a tap on his shoulder. He turned annoyed, expecting to see a passenger. Instead, he was face to face with a federal agent holding up a badge. "Rick Peterson, you're under arrest." Simultaneously, two other agents boxed in the courier, Leo, before he could even process what was happening. "Don't move. Hands where I can see them." Across the checkpoint, Eleanor Vance herself, flanked by two more agents, walked directly up to David Chen at his podium. "Supervisor Chen," she said, her voice devoid of all emotion, "you have the right to remain silent." The chaos was controlled, a whirlwind of quiet efficiency. Within 30 seconds, Peterson, Chen, and Leo were in cuffs, their faces a mixture of shock, confusion, and utter defeat. Peterson's eyes scanned the crowd frantically and then locked onto a figure standing at the glass overlook of the surveillance room. It was Julian. He wasn't wearing his travel blazer now. He was in a tactical polo, the letters FBI stark white against the dark fabric. He stared down at Peterson, his expression unreadable. For a moment, their eyes met across the vast terminal. There was no triumph in Julian's gaze, only a quiet, resolute finality. He had not started this. He had not sought this confrontation, but he had finished it. The other TSA officers stood frozen, their mouths agape. Sarah Jenkins, who had been working in a different lane as instructed, watched with tears of relief streaming down her face. Passengers, startled by the sudden, silent takedown, pointed and whispered, their cell phones held aloft. Agents began to process the scene. The black roller bag was opened on the table for all to see. It was, as Sarah had said, filled with dozens of brand new shrink-wrapped smartphones. But tucked underneath them, nestled in foam cutouts, were several smaller, vacuum-sealed packages. Rolling's voice came over the comms, tense and urgent. "Julian, you need to see this. The package is in the bag. It's not just phones. We found a dozen high-grade fake passports and a set of detonator caps." A cold dread washed over Julian. This was infinitely worse than they had imagined. They weren't just smuggling electronics for profit. They were supplying terrorists. Peterson and Chen, for a few $1,000s, had been willing to help smuggle the tools of mass murder onto a passenger plane. Julian's profiling at the hands of Rick Peterson had not just been an act of prejudice. It had been a catastrophic miscalculation by a corrupt officer that had inadvertently led the FBI to uncover a genuine, active threat to national security. The hard karma that had come for Rick Peterson was no longer just about his own ruin. It was about the countless lives that had just been saved. The fallout from Operation Broken Gate was swift and devastating. Rick Peterson and David Chen, faced with overwhelming evidence and the prospect of spending the rest of their lives in a supermax prison on terrorism-related charges, began to talk. Their confessions painted a sordid picture of greed and betrayal. It had started small, with looking the other way for smugglers bringing in counterfeit luxury goods. But the money was too good, and their contacts, part of a sophisticated international criminal syndicate, pushed for more. Soon they were moving anything and everything, cash, stolen technology, and eventually tools for terror. Their confessions led the FBI to a wider network, resulting in a dozen more arrests across 3 cities. The smuggling ring that had used O'Hare as their personal gateway was shattered. The story made national news, though Julian's role was, by necessity, kept out of the official reports. He was referred to only as an observant federal agent whose initial encounter with the officers triggered the investigation. For Rick Peterson, the karma was absolute. Stripped of his job, his pension, and his freedom, he was sentenced to 30 years in federal prison with no possibility of parole. His name became a byword for corruption within the TSA, a cautionary tale of how the smallest abuse of power can fester into the greatest of betrayals. David Chen, for his cooperation, received a lesser sentence of 15 years. At O'Hare, the TSA conducted a massive internal overhaul. Sarah Jenkins, who had risked her career to tell the truth, was hailed as a hero. She was given a promotion and placed in a new integrity and oversight unit created in the wake of the scandal. She became a driving force for change, ensuring that the system that had enabled Peterson and Chen could never take root again. Amelia Vance, the lawyer who had recorded the initial incident, became a vocal advocate for passenger rights and police accountability, using the anonymized story in lectures and op-eds as a powerful example of why civilian oversight is crucial. A month after the arrests, Julian Hayes was once again at an airport, this time JFK in New York. He was heading overseas, back to the shadows where he did his real work. As he stood in the security line, he felt a familiar tension, a wariness that would likely never leave him. He watched the TSA officers, his mind reflexively analyzing their behavior, their posture, their tone. A young, professional-looking officer waved him forward. "Good morning, sir," the officer said with a polite smile. "Laptop out, please." Julian complied, his movements as fluid as ever. He passed through the scanner without a beep. As he collected his belongings, he saw his Pelican case being flagged for a secondary check. For a split second, his entire body tensed. But this time, it was different. A female supervisor immediately came over. "Sir," she said respectfully, "our scanner flagged this as a high-density item. Would you be more comfortable with a private screening? We have a room right over here." Julian looked at her, at the professionalism in her eyes, at the adherence to the very protocol that Rick Peterson had so violently rejected. He saw the ripple effect of that day in Chicago. He saw progress. "Thank you," Julian replied, a genuine warmth in his voice. "Yes, I would appreciate that." As he was escorted to the private room, he knew that the world was still a dangerous place. He knew that prejudice and corruption had not been vanquished from the earth. But he also knew that sometimes standing up for one's own dignity in the face of ugliness could send a shockwave through the system, exposing a deeper darkness and, in the process, allowing a little more light to get in. The memory of Rick Peterson's sneer would forever be a reminder of the battle. But the quiet professionalism of this new encounter was a symbol of the victory. The storm had passed, and for now the skies were clear. In the end, this was more than just a story of an FBI agent putting a racist TSA officer in his place. It was a stark reminder that the systems we rely on for our safety are only as strong as the integrity of the people who run them. Rick Peterson's personal prejudice wasn't just an attitude. It was a vulnerability, a crack in the armor of national security that a criminal syndicate exploited for their own terrifying ends. It took one man, Agent Julian Hayes, refusing to be dehumanized, to pull on that single thread and unravel a conspiracy that could have led to tragedy. His ordeal reminds us that standing up to injustice, no matter how small it seems, can have consequences that ripple out in ways we can never predict, sometimes saving lives we will never know. If this story of karma and consequence resonated with you, please show your support by hitting that like button, sharing this video with someone who needs to hear it, and subscribing to our channel for more true stories of justice and unexpected twists. What would you have done in Agent Hayes' position? Let us know in the comments below.